After the horrible crash of Germanwings Flight 9525, where a pilot locked his colleague out of the cockpit and then flew his aircraft straight into a French mountainside, most people would find it unthinkable that a pilot would ever be left alone inside of a cockpit of a passenger aircraft. And yet, here we have a pilot completely alone in the cockpit, with his colleague desperately trying to get in from outside the locked door again. How is that possible? Stay tuned. Saturday the 17th of February 2024 was a cloudy and damp day in Frankfurt, Germany. It had been raining throughout the morning, and with the temperature hovering around 10 degrees Celsius, the two Lufthansa pilots who were scheduled to operate flight 1140 down towards Seville in Spain were likely quite happy to do so. This was going to be the last day of a 4-day rotation that these pilots had flown together, and to finish a duty with two nice long sectors at a reasonable time in the morning is normally a bit of a luxury. The captain was 43 years old at the time and was currently rated on the Airbus A320 family. And the final report gave no details on how many total hours or hours on the type that he had, but we do know that his medical license had no limitations on it apart from him having to wear glasses, which is something a lot of commercial pilots, including myself, have. His colleague, the first officer, was 38 years old and was flying on something known as an MPL, a multi-pilot license, which had first been issued back in 2019. So even though we don't know his exact number of flight hours either, we can assume that by the time of this flight he was quite experienced. His medical license was also without limitations, and he had undergone his last medical examination back in May of 2023, with nothing out of the ordinary noted. Now, I'm talking about medical licenses here, so maybe this is a good time to explain a bit about what's required from a commercial pilot when it comes to medical fitness. I will refer to European EASA rules here, but the rules are similar all around the world. Before anyone can get licensed to fly any type of aircraft, they have to go through something known as an initial medical certification. Now, the requirements are lower if you only intend to fly recreationally, in which case you will need a Class 2 or even something known as an LAPL, Light Aircraft Pilot Medical License. But if you intend to fly commercially, meaning as an airline pilot, taxi pilot or flight instructor for example, well then you will need to get a Class 1 medical. The requirements for that are much stricter and requires an initial examination at something known as an aeromedical center, where your vision, heart function, color vision and many other things needs to fall within certain criteria. Once a pilot has passed that initial examination, which normally takes about a day to get through, the Class 1 medical then has to be annually renewed through a less detailed medical examination, which can be done at either an aeromedical center or by an aeromedical examiner, an AME, which is a doctor authorized to do these tests. Now, there are more details involved here, but the point I want to make is that a pilot's health is monitored throughout their career, and any decline in health, use of medicine or medical procedure needs to be reported to the pilot's AME and evaluated to make sure that the medical fitness to fly is still valid. As you can imagine, this is a source of quite some worry and anxiety in the industry, since our livelihoods are so closely connected to our health. But there are special types of insurances called loss of license insurances that have been created exactly for this reason. These insurances come in different formats, but will normally pay out either a lump sum or a monthly stipend if a pilot should suddenly lose the medical. Anyway, that was a little bit of a sidestep, but I think it is important that you understand the background before we continue this story. At around 8 o'clock in the morning, the two pilots met up in the crew room in Frankfurt Airport to start planning for their coming two flights. The 3 previous days had been really nice, and they had both enjoyed each other's company, with the captain finding the first officer to be both SOP-minded and very competent. The weather at their destination, Seville, was forecasted to be sunny but not particularly warm, and all in all, despite the grey weather in Germany, the day's operations looked pretty straightforward. There were no major NOTAMs to worry about, and the flight plans both looked pretty standard. So the two pilots soon decided on how much fuel they wanted and then walked over to brief their 4 cabin crew members about the day. Once that was done, they then all walked together out towards the gate where their aircraft was already waiting for them. Now, these pilots were rated on the Airbus A320 family, and on this day they were going to operate the longest member of this group, the Airbus A321. That's a beautiful, long and sleek aircraft with two IAE V2500 high bypass turbofan engines mounted under its wings. And the fact that this was an Airbus is soon going to have a major impact on this story. As the crew were walking down towards their aircraft, the pilots decided that the first officer was going to fly the aircraft down to Seville, and the captain was then going to be pilot monitoring. They would then switch the roles on the way home, and generally speaking, this is often the way that I would choose to do things as well on the first flight of the day. You see, doing the first sector as pilot monitoring gives me as a captain some extra time to look through the tech log properly and to do the first walk around, which is always nice. So, said and done, once the tech log had been reviewed and found to have no important outstanding items in it, the captain went outside and the first officer started preparing the aircraft for departure. And since this was the very first flight of that day, those checks would have included a functional check of the bulletproof cockpit door, which is something that I will get back to later. In any case, the passengers soon also started boarding, and at around time 09:35, all 199 of them were in their seats, meaning that the aircraft had a total head count of 205 when the cabin crew started closing the doors for departure. The last few checks were then completed, and at time 09:41, Lufthansa Flight 1140 initiated its pushback from gate A13 and then started the engines as normal. After that, the pilots requested taxi instructions and then started taxiing out towards runway 18, which was the active runway for departure on that morning. So far, so good. All pre-departure checks went off smoothly with nothing out of the ordinary. So at time 09:57, the first officer moved the thrust levers into the flex detent position and the aircraft started accelerating down the runway. The takeoff and initial climb went off without any problems, and they were soon cleared to turn westwards towards Paris and asked to climb up to their planned cruising level of flight level 350. Now, once we pilots reach the cruise level, there are loads of different minor tasks that needs to be performed. Generally, the pilot monitoring will fill in things like the off-block and takeoff time in the electronic flight plan, verify the actual fuel burned against the plan, and then start noting down times that we pass over certain waypoints in order to follow up on the flight plan. The pilot flying will monitor the instruments and apply any changes to the route that the controller might give us, but this is also when we tend to ask for our second cup of coffee, especially in the morning. So even though that wasn't specifically mentioned in the report, I'm guessing that this was the case here as well, and what goes in will eventually come out. We interrupt this message to bring you a round of hacker bingo. How safe is your data? Let's find out. First, you got a vague email about an outstanding invoice from a person or company that you've never heard of. Sorry, your email address has been leaked. Second, got a call about your car's extended warranty. How did they even get your number? Next up, you search for hotels in Tokyo once, and now everywhere you scroll there are ads for things to do in Japan. Your digital footprint is definitely being tracked. And finally, a security alert about someone trying to access your Netflix account pops up with a link that definitely does not lead to Netflix.
Bingo.
Now, if you got bingo here or really got any of these things, I'm sorry, but your personal information is likely all over the internet, being sold to the highest bidders by hundreds of different data brokers. But luckily, today's sponsor, Incogni, can help you clean that mess up. Incogni work by hunting down these brokers one by one and then forcing them to remove your information from their services. So, if you sign up, that will hopefully stop you from ever having to play this horrible game again. I was amazed of just how many of these brokers were selling my data when I first signed up, and my phone and inbox is now much quieter and safer. So to start cleaning your data up from the web, use this QR code or go to incogni.com/pilot. That will give you an awesome 60% discount if you use the code PILOT, so head over there and check them out. Thank you Incogni for sponsoring this channel, and now let's get back to that Lufthansa flight and its pilots. Now before we go any further, there are a few things that I need to explain to you regarding how we pilots monitor each other for potential medical issues, as well as how our lives and work have been affected by a couple of horrific historical events. If we start with incapacitation checks, it's very important to remember that even though we have our medical class 1 licenses, we are still very much human and can therefore fall ill just like everyone else. This is why it is so important that there are 2 pilots in the cockpit, because in the very unlikely event of one of the pilots getting sick, the remaining pilot is both trained and able to safely get the aircraft, passengers and crew down on the ground again. Now, incapacitations can be either obvious or subtle, meaning that they can vary from a sudden heart attack and immediate unconsciousness to psychological issues or illnesses where a pilot just stops making sense or start acting in strange and inappropriate ways. The way we mitigate against these things is by continuously just keeping a friendly eye on our colleague, looking out for any of these signs. But it's also done through the use of strict standard operating procedures, SOPs, which must be done in a certain order and with certain specific call-outs. If a pilot starts deviating from those procedures or doesn't respond to a call-out, well, then that's a sign of possible incapacitation, and we then normally try to draw attention to that deviation or make a second clear call-out. Now, if there is still no response to that, well then we start activating the pilot incapacitation protocol, which I will soon get back to. This is known as the 2-call rule and is to my knowledge used by basically all airlines out there. The second thing I want to talk about is the multitude of ways that our lives have changed as a result of the horrific terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001 in New York. Before that, the flight crew's lives were much simpler and much more innocent. Sure, there had been hijackings before, but those were always either political or due to some kind of mental issue. No one had even considered that an aircraft full of passengers could be hijacked and used as a weapon. But after 9/11, we were all faced with this horrible new reality, and as a direct result, the cockpit had to be closed and protected in completely new ways. It took a few years of debate in the industry, but starting quite soon after the attacks in May of 2003, all passenger category cockpits started being outfitted with special lockable security doors. These doors could withstand handgun bullets as well as all sorts of other abuse in order to stop any unauthorized person from entering. And with the locked cockpit door now came a whole host of other more subtle threats. One of them was that cabin crew and flight crew now became divided into 2 more or less separate teams, which came with its own CRM and communication difficulties. But the most obvious problem was how to secure access to the cockpit for the right people and at the same time making sure that the wrong people would not enter under any circumstances. Now this might sound easy, but if you think about it, it is actually quite hard. You see, most aircraft don't have lavatories in the cockpit, which means that the pilots will have to leave the cockpit at regular intervals during a working day when nature calls. This therefore necessitates specific procedures for how to do this, whilst not creating a potential for a nefarious actor to utilize those moments as a security weakness. Now, for obvious reasons, I will not go into how these procedures work in detail, but all airlines have their own variations, and what you need to know is that a fundamental principle of all these procedures is that the pilots in the cockpit must have the ability to deny entry from the outside no matter what happens. This was seen as an absolute necessity after the 9/11 attacks, since potential hijackers could also potentially take crew or passengers hostage and try to pressure them into giving up their security protocols. But as long as the pilots could then stop whoever tried to get in anyway, that would be of absolutely no use, and the aircraft could not be turned into a weapon. Or so everyone thought. But what no one had considered was how this system would work in case a pilot would try to utilize it to do something unthinkable. and then came Germanwings Flight 9525. Now, I will likely tell you that full story at some point. I haven't done so far because I always want my videos to be constructive and show how the industry learned from even the most terrible of accidents. But in the case of that particular flight, there is very little to learn. It's mostly just pitch black darkness. Anyway, the gist of that story is that the co-pilot of the flight, who was allegedly suffering from some psychological issues at the time, took the chance when the captain went to the toilet to lock the cockpit door and then denied the captain re-entry. After that, he selected a descent mode on his Airbus's mode control panel and flew the aircraft and the 150 passengers and crew on board straight into a mountainside in the French Alps. Now, when I eventually make a video about this, I will have found something constructive about it, likely around mental health. But what you need to understand for this video is that this crash opened up a whole new can of worms for the aviation industry. Here was a tragedy that had been made possible exactly because of a security system that had been put in place. So, what could now be done about that? Well, one pretty obvious thing that the industry quickly suggested was that no one should ever be left alone in the cockpit going forward. So EASA, the European Aviation Regulator, soon formulated what's known as a SIB, a Safety Information Bulletin, with number 2015-04. In that, they recommended that there should be 2 qualified persons in the cockpit at all times. If a pilot needed to go to the toilet, well, then a cabin crew member should enter and stay behind, monitoring the remaining pilot. Now, most airlines at the time already had such a rule in place, not to guard against suicidal pilots, but to make sure that if the remaining pilot would suffer from some kind of illness, they could quickly help, and also to potentially open the locked cockpit door for the pilot outside. But the problem was that this procedure had not been applied by all airlines before, and the few who hadn't now either conformed to this recommendation or were very against it, arguing that this rule introduced completely new security weaknesses. So, in light of that criticism, EASA re-evaluated their stance, and in 2016 they came out with a slightly altered SIB, who basically said that it was up to the operator to do a proper assessment of the risks involved. And based on that assessment, they could then decide if they wanted to use a 2-person minimum in the cockpit or not. Which brings us to Lufthansa and their procedures. So the company Germanwings, who suffered that horrible tragedy with Flight 9525 back in 2015, was a wholly owned subsidiary to Lufthansa. So initially, after that tragedy, they quickly implemented a fleet-wide adoption of the first SIB, requiring 2 people in the cockpit at all times. But then, as the years went on and in agreement with that latest SIB, the company made a reassessment of the risks and decided that having 2 persons in the cockpit was no longer needed, at least in cruise for short periods like for a toilet break. The pilot leaving the cockpit was still supposed to evaluate the physical and psychological fitness of the remaining pilot, but if that all looked okay, well then he or she could be left alone. Now, I know that there's likely a lot of people out there just cringing when they hear this, and whilst I'm sure that Lufthansa had very compelling safety statistics to motivate that decision, I personally don't really understand it. Sure, the likelihood of a pilot's suicide is thankfully very, very low, but not zero, as Germanwings 9525 had clearly shown. And on top of that, pilot incapacitations do also happen, and they don't always come with warning signs. Actually, recent research found 39 cases of pilot incapacitations under FAA rules during a 6-year period, and another study made in 2004 in the United Kingdom found 36 incapacitations and 4 sudden deaths in only 1 year. These type of studies have been conducted all over the world, all with very similar results, and the major causes of pilot incapacitations included loss of consciousness, gastrointestinal issues, neurological events like epileptic seizures, as well as cardiovascular problems like heart attacks. Now, the reason that you don't often hear about these are, like I mentioned before, because of the presence of that second pilot, who is more than capable of keeping the aircraft flying and bringing it down safely. But that's providing that they are actually in the cockpit. So this all brings us back to Lufthansa Flight 1140, who was now proceeding steadily down towards Seville. At around time 10:30, the captain felt the inevitable result of his morning coffee, so he informed his colleague that he needed to go to the bathroom. They had just passed into Spanish airspace at the time, but there was still plenty of distance left before they had to start preparing for the approach, so this would have been the perfect time to get this done. The two pilots then discussed the weather ahead as well as some minor plans for the immediate operation of the aircraft before the captain initiated the procedure for opening the door to get outside. Now again, for security reasons, I will not go into what these procedures entails, but what you need to know is that every airline have their own dedicated procedures that needs to be followed to the letter before the cockpit door is ever opened in flight. That weather and operational discussion that the pilots had just had formed part of the captain's checking up on his colleague, as their procedures actually stipulated. But since they had been flying for 4 days together at this point and the first officer was looking and sounding perfectly fine, I don't think that the captain was very worried here. As this was going on, the aircraft was about 90 miles northeast of Madrid, talking to the northern Madrid control sector, somewhere close to Zaragoza. And before the captain had a chance to get out of his seat, the controller called the aircraft up, asking if they were experiencing any turbulence, to which the captain answered, "Only light chop." Then, at time 10:31 and 30 seconds, the captain handed over the radios to the first officer, who would now be in charge of both the pilot flying and the pilot monitoring roles. He then got out of his seat, checked the galley area, and exited the cockpit with the cockpit door locking securely behind him. The first officer was now completely alone, with a bulletproof door between him and his colleague. 46 seconds after the captain had left, the cockpit voice recorder started recording sounds of the first officer experiencing some sort of sudden and severe incapacitation. And during the following minute, several out-of-sequence and unrelated system selections were then picked up by the flight data recorder. These included the disconnection of spoiler and elevator computer number 3, which can be done from a push button on the overhead panel, the weather radar being switched from weather and turbulence over to turbulence only, which is done from a rotary switch on the central pedestal, and the Morse code for the tune VOR, Bravo Alpha November, suddenly starting to sound in the cockpit, which is something that must be selected from the corresponding reception knob on the audio control panel. Now, these actions makes no sense at all and are therefore likely signs of the co-pilot's arms just flaying around in the cockpit or of uncontrollable actions just randomly happening. The deactivation of the SEC-3 also triggered a master caution and an associated ECAM warning, but this was not the only thing the first officer's seizure was now causing. No, the next thing was far more terrifying. You see, the flight data recorder now also picked up a sudden increase in force applied to the first officer's right rudder pedal, a force reaching 488 Newton. Now, both the autopilot and autothrust was engaged at this point, but a fundamental principle in most autopilots is that if a pilot is starting to input on the controls, well, then the aircraft should assume that the pilot needs to override whatever the autopilot is doing and just disconnect. That's certainly the case in the Boeing 737 that I fly. Well, if the rudder input would be very, very small, well, then the Boeing's autopilot could initially try and counteract it with aileron to maintain the intended course. But if the input would be bigger than what the ailerons can handle, then the autopilot would just disengage. And with that hard right rudder being applied, this would then lead to a sudden right yaw, followed by a roll to the right and an eventual spiral dive if the rudder input is maintained. Now, fortunately for everyone on board, the autopilot on the Airbus works slightly differently. Since it uses fly-by-wire, this sudden rudder input was now fed to the aircraft's flight control computers, who evaluated the input and found it highly inappropriate. So instead of allowing the full input to activate the rudder, it only let through a very small amount, causing a 5-degree roll and a 2-degree heading change, whilst also issuing a stop rudder input ECAM warning, together with another master caution warning. Now, I cannot overemphasize just how important this safety feature was here. If the aircraft would have instead initiated the yaw, which the seizing pilot's right leg was now asking for, the ensuing yaw and spiral dive could have created large and increasing G-forces, which in turn could have made it very difficult for anyone outside of the cockpit to even try to gain access. And with no one inside except for the incapacitated first officer, there would have been no way to then rectify the situation unless he would suddenly recover by himself. Now, it's important as well to say that the Airbus system also has a limit value of pilot input, after which it will disconnect. And from what I have been able to find, that sits at around 45 to 50 decanewton, including some further criteria. So, with the first officer now pushing 488 newton or 48.8 decanewton, that limit could not have been far off. But the important thing was that it didn't happen. Instead, the aircraft just continued its flight on autopilot along airway Upper November 857 towards waypoint Baneb, but with no conscious pilot by its controls. Now, during the initial minute of this incapacitation, the Northern Madrid control sector tried to contact the aircraft on 3 separate occasions in order to transfer them over to the next sector, but obviously without receiving any reply. The controller therefore called up the next sector to try and see if the aircraft had somehow already transferred over there, but just as it did so, another Lufthansa flight called up, which was then erroneously interpreted as Flight 1140 by the Northern controller. So this all meant that air traffic control didn't raise any prolonged loss of communication alarm as this was happening. Now, outside in the passenger cabin, no one had initially noticed anything out of the ordinary. So, when the pilot was done in the bathroom, he came out and initiated the procedure for regaining access to the cockpit. And even though, again, I can't go into the specifics here, what I can tell you is that the lock for the cockpit door includes a keypad programmed with several different codes. One of those can be used to just notify the pilot remaining in the cockpit that someone is asking for permission to enter. And that pilot should then verify that nothing nefarious is going on before deciding to manually unlock the door. So the captain now entered this code, but got no response back. He assumed that he had just put the wrong code in, so he tried again, still with no response, and then again, and again, and again. Still nothing. Now, I cannot even imagine the kind of horror that must have been going through the mind of this captain as each new attempt failed. Remember, this was more or less exactly how the German wings disaster had started. There is also an emergency code created precisely for this kind of situation, which, if entered, will cause a very different tone to sound in the cockpit. If this code is entered, the pilot inside the cockpit can still deny entry to whoever is trying it, but if there is no response from the cockpit, like in the case of an incapacitation, well, then the door will automatically unlock after a time delay. So this code was now entered, followed by what must have been the longest seconds of this captain's life. But luckily, the first officer must have now recovered slightly from the worst of his seizures and could therefore manually unlock the door before the timer had run out. But before we get to what happened next, I just want to point something out here. The control panel for the cockpit door in the Airbus cockpit uses a toggle switch, which can be toggled to either lock or unlock, depending on what the pilot wants. If the emergency code is entered and the pilot thinks that it's a security threat, they can therefore choose the lock position, which will then stop any further entry attempts for a predetermined time. This is a super important security feature, making sure that hijackers cannot get access to the cockpit. But for a lonely pilot in the cockpit suffering from seizures, I would say that the risk of that button being toggled in the wrong direction by mistake would be quite high. And if that would have happened here, no help would have been able to enter, at least not for a while. So I personally think that this incident clearly shows that there should always be at least 2 qualified people inside the cockpit whilst airborne. Whatever security concerns that the opponents of this rule have cannot possibly outweigh the risk of incapacitation, and I won't even start on the idiotic move towards single-pilot cockpits, which the FAA and EASA are apparently now looking at. My friend and fellow captain Ben and I had a long discussion about this in our podcast, Captain Speaking, recently, and you can check out our very unscripted thoughts on that topic here. And by the way, please consider subscribing to that new channel, and you can also listen to it wherever you find your podcasts. Anyway, the captain now finally gained access to the cockpit, and the first thing that you need to do in a situation like this is to take control of the aircraft, remove the incapacitated pilots from the controls, and then verify the position of all relevant controls and switches. So that's exactly what this captain now did, which included going through those ECAM actions indicated on his screens in order to reset the correct configuration. And that was then followed by him asking for help from his cabin crew to check on his colleague. And in this case, they could clearly see that the first officer was still pale, sweating and moving around strangely. So he was quickly removed from his seat and taken out to the forward galley, where a doctor who was traveling as a passenger attended to him and also diagnosed a possible heart condition. Based on that information, the captain decided that he needed to divert in order to give his colleagues some proper medical attention. But here, it's very important to point out a few things about these kind of situations. When we practice piloting capacitations in the simulator, it's super important to highlight to the remaining pilot that the overall safety of the aircraft and its passengers takes priority over the sick colleague. This means that we must still maintain our normal safety margins and not to rush things just to try to get down quickly. We will obviously speed up as much as possible, ask for a priority and so on, but it's very important not to get yourself sucked into trying to take shortcuts, which could end up in a non-stabilized approach or something even worse. It's important to remember that not only is this going to be a non-normal, non-briefed maneuver, it will also be flown without the normal backup from a competent colleague, something that we normally always otherwise have. In this case, the captain quickly contacted the Northern Madrid controller, which he had been talking to before, and that controller must have been very surprised, since he thought that the flight had already left his frequency. Initially, the captain asked for a diversion towards Madrid, which was now behind them for medical reasons, but he later also declared a full medical emergency, and the controller obviously complied. Now, one thing that stuck out to me here was that medical emergency call. You see, a medical emergency is what we normally call for when a passenger or cabin crew member falls ill, but when we're down to only one pilot, it's actually more prudent to declare a Mayday, Mayday, Mayday pilot incapacitation, as that is a far more critical emergency. Declaring pilot incapacitation will, for example, tell the air traffic controllers to slow down and reduce the workload on the remaining pilot, and in the case of a captain incapacitation, it can also mean that the aircraft can't be maneuvered on the ground after landing, since the nose wheel tiller is only available on the captain's side on some aircraft types. This also gives me the chance to answer some questions I normally get when I talk about pilot incapacitation procedures. If it is the captain who gets sick, the first officer should not change seats, even if he or she then is the de facto commander of the aircraft. This is because they have no training to fly the aircraft from the left side, and the same goes for taxiing the aircraft after landing. It's far better to just advise the controller that you won't be able to taxi on the ground, so the runway will be blocked after landing, and just prepare for an engine shutdown on the runway to allow emergency vehicles to approach and help your sick colleague from there. The same generally also goes for using autolands. Even though an autoland might sound like a great option in these circumstances, it depends heavily on what type of training that the first officer or captain has received. If they are not used to do autolands from their seats, and the weather is good, well then a normal landing is often preferable, since it deviates less from what the remaining pilot is used to. Now, if you have more questions about this, please write them down in the comments below, and Ben and I might choose your question to answer in our next podcast. Anyway, Flight 1140 now quickly started its descent and soon received progressive radar vectors towards Madrid. In the cockpit, the captain would have then set up for the arrival by himself, as well as done all of the applicable performance calculations and briefings. And when it comes to briefings, this is actually another thing that I always used to emphasize when I was teaching these kind of scenarios. It might feel super silly to be sitting up there just talking to yourself, but it is actually critically important that this is done. Briefings often include things like cross-checking that the minimas are set, as well as other crucial functions, and in the case of the Boeing 737 that I fly, the plus 50 and minima call made by the aircraft is triggered from whatever minima is set on the captain's side. This means that if a first officer finds him or herself in a situation like this and doesn't call out the minimas as part of their briefing, well, then they might forget to set it on the captain's side and therefore get incorrect calls on the approach, which is literally the last thing that you need. On top of that, it's also advisable to keep a cabin crew in the cockpit during approach and landing to help with things like reading the checklist and check on the well-being of the remaining pilot. Now, these procedures might differ from airline to airline, but for the same reason that one pilot shouldn't be left alone in the first place, the now only remaining pilot shouldn't be left alone either. If a cabin crew is to remain in the cockpit, then he or she should sit down on the jump seat and not in the empty pilot seat, since they are not trained to sit there. I always use the quick reference handbook, QRH, which includes all of the applicable checklists, and let them read the descent, approach and landing checklist from there, but that's just my own procedure. When it comes to how to fly the aircraft, again, the most important thing here is to try and stay as close to the normal procedures as possible. This includes making all of the normal call-outs, but since the remaining pilot will now be both the pilot flying and pilot monitoring, he or she will now need to do both set of calls. So, flaps 1, speed checks, flaps 1, and so on. Again, this might feel a bit silly, but all of those calls have important functions, so calling them out and playing both roles will keep the remaining pilots in a familiar setting, which will hopefully reduce stress and mistakes. Remember, pilots are not used to fly airliners silently, so to start doing that in a situation like this would not be a great idea. Also, once the pilot has everything under control and have formulated a plan, like in this case where the captain decided to divert to Madrid, it's then super important to keep everyone else in the loop. Air traffic control maybe knows what's going on, but they still need to know what you're planning to do, and so does your cabin crew and the passengers. So when the workload is suitable, maybe during a long descending vector, it's important that the pilot gives the cabin crew something known as a NITS briefing, which stands for the nature of the problem, intentions, in this case going to Madrid, time available, typically around 20 to 25 minutes for a diversion from cruise if there's an airport close by, and finally, special procedures that might be needed. Here, for example, it would be important to follow normal procedures and passenger announcements, but also to instruct the passengers to remain seated after landing in order to allow quick access for the medical staff. And after that, it is time for the pilot's PA. And in this case, a public announcement is absolutely crucial. Remember that a big portion of the aircraft might have actually seen that a pilot has been removed from the cockpit and is now receiving medical care in the front, and not all passengers knows that the aircraft can be flown safely by only one pilot, especially if that pilot happens to be the first officer. So with that in mind, this PA must be made in a calm and competent manner, outlining what you're going to do and supporting the authority of your cabin crew. And it also could include some type of short information about what the passengers can expect after, like, once the medical personnel have assisted my colleague, I will inform you about your ongoing travel plans. That will take focus away from the emergency and instead point it forward towards their own travel plans, which normally fills a comforting function. So as you can see, there are a lot of things to think about in an emergency like this, but as always, the most important guiding principle is aviate, navigate and communicate in that order. In any case, flight 1140 was eventually vectored in for the ILS approach for runway 32 left in Madrid-Barajas Airport, and at time 11:04 UTC, it landed safely and then taxied off the runway. Since the captain had asked for the attendance of an ambulance on arrival, the aircraft was guided by a follow-me car to a stand close by the runway, where the first officer was then quickly offloaded and rushed to a nearby hospital. And after several tests, it was eventually concluded that the seizures that he had suffered from was the result of a previously undiagnosed neurological condition. And that sadly will mean that he likely won't be able to continue flying. As part of the post-flight interviews, the first officer also stated that he had lost consciousness at some point after the captain had left the cockpit, and that he had no memories of anything else until he woke up on the galley floor whilst being attended to by the cabin crew and a doctor. So all in all, this aircraft had been flown without a conscious pilot at the controls for about 10 whole minutes. After the first officer had been removed by the ambulance, the captain arranged for buses to the terminal for the passengers and crew, or possibly for the aircraft to be towed to the stand first. The report was a bit unclear about that. But he also remembered to protect both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder, which made it much easier for the investigators to look into what had really happened. They finally determined that the first officer's incapacitation had been caused by that previously undetected neurological condition, something that had never previously manifested itself to neither the pilot nor his doctors. The investigators also examined loads of international reports on pilot incapacitations, and based on that, they issued a recommendation to EASA to inform all operators out there about this event, so that they could use it to reassess the need for a second person in the flight deck at all times, something that both the investigators and I found to be a very good idea. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments here below. Now, if you want to see my next video before everyone else, possibly even today, well then, scan this QR code or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot and sign up. I am planning another Patreon hangout very soon, and I would love to see you there. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.